The first thing my mother said when she opened the door was, "Why are you here?" Not hello, not my name, not even surprise. Just that. Why are you here? I was still standing on the front step with my weekender bag in one hand and a bakery box in the other. It was 6:12 p.m. on a Thursday in early October, and I remember the exact time because I had looked at my phone in the driveway to steady myself before I rang the bell. I was 34 years old. I had driven 2 hours in traffic to get there, and my own mother looked at me like I was a delivery mistake. She had one hand still on the door and the other folded across her stomach. Her lipstick was already done for the evening. Her blouse was pressed. There was music playing somewhere deeper in the house, and the smell of rosemary and browned butter coming from the kitchen. Behind her, I could see the dining room lit up warm and gold. They had started dinner without me. Then my father stepped into view beside her, glanced at the bag in my hand, and gave me the kind of smile he used when he was about to be cruel and call it honesty. "Well," he said, "look who finally remembered where we live." Before I could answer, my younger brother called out from the dining room, "Who is it?" My mother didn't lower her voice when she answered, "It's Nora. Just Nora. Not your sister, not my daughter." And something about the flatness of it told me everything before the night had even really begun. My brother came around the corner in his suit jacket, drink still in his hand, looked me up and down once, and laughed softly. "You actually came," he said. I remember shifting the bakery box to my other hand because my fingers had gone numb. It was still warm on the bottom. I had picked it up from a little French place near my apartment because my mother used to love their pear tart. I told myself in the car that bringing something thoughtful would make me feel less like I was arriving empty. That was before I saw their faces. "Of course she came," my father said. "She always comes when there's an audience." That line landed exactly the way he wanted it to. I heard my sister-in-law laugh from the dining room. Then my mother looked past me toward the driveway and asked, "Where did you park?" I turned slightly and pointed toward the curb. "We have people coming," she said. "You should move your car." That was the moment. Not the first cold look. Not my father's comment. Not even the fact that they had clearly not set a place for me. It was that. "You should move your car." Like I wasn't someone arriving home, like I was a problem in the way. I looked at her for a second, then at the dining room behind her. 4 place settings on one side, 2 on the other. Crystal water glasses, linen napkins, my mother's wedding silver. Not a single extra plate. No seat for me. If you're listening from somewhere tonight, tell me where. I always like knowing how far a story travels. And if you've ever been treated like an inconvenience by the people who should know you best, stay with me. Comment the word unseen. I read those. I didn't argue on the porch. That's one thing people never understand about moments like that. They think the pain would make you loud. Sometimes it does the opposite. Sometimes it makes you very, very still. So I moved my car. I set the bakery box carefully on the passenger seat, backed out, and parked half a block down under a maple tree that was just starting to turn. Then I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield for a full minute. I should have left. I know that now. But when you spend your whole life trying to earn a softer version of love, you can mistake endurance for hope. So I got out, walked back up the block, and let myself in through the side gate like somebody making a delivery. That had always been my role in that family anyway. Not guest, not equal, useful person entering through the side. By the time I stepped into the kitchen, my mother had already recovered her social voice. There were 6 people in the dining room. My parents, my younger brother Evan and his wife Talia, my aunt Denise, and a man I didn't know yet who turned out to be a commercial lender from a regional bank. I would understand why he was there later. My mother looked at me and smiled in a way that never reached her eyes. "There she is," she said. Nora decided to come after all. After all, as if I had been uncertain. As if I had nearly failed some test. My father didn't stand. He just gestured vaguely toward the counter. "You can put that there." I set the tart box down near the sink. No one thanked me for bringing it. There was no place card with my name because there was no place. My mother opened a cabinet, took down a plain white plate instead of one of the blue-edged dinner plates already on the table, and placed it at the far corner closest to the kitchen doorway. Not at the table exactly. Attached to it. A child's afterthought. A spillover seat. A place set so lightly it could disappear in a second. I remember looking at that plate and feeling something in my chest go cold and precise. My brother noticed me noticing. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Sorry, we didn't know if you were actually coming." That was not true. My mother had texted me 4 days earlier. Sunday, 8:07 p.m. Family dinner Thursday. Be here at 6. Please don't make this difficult. That was her exact wording. Please don't make this difficult. I still had the message. I had not replied because in my family replying was often less safe than arriving prepared. So I had shown up on time, with dessert, in a navy dress and low black heels, carrying exactly the version of myself they had trained me to present: polite, put together, easy to place. And they had still made sure I understood I was not really invited, just tolerated. I sat down at the corner place setting and folded my hands in my lap. The lender, a man named Scott Mercer, looked at me and smiled politely. "Nice to meet you," he said. "I've heard a lot about this family." I almost laughed. My Aunt Denise gave me one quick, sympathetic glance, then looked back at her wine. That was Denise's way. Never cruel herself. Never brave enough to interrupt it either. My mother started serving the chicken. Talia asked Evan about the new house they were building in Cherry Hills. My father asked Scott about rate forecasts and timing. My mother asked Talia whether the dining room sconces had arrived. Everyone had a subject they were allowed to have. Then, eventually, my mother turned to me the way people do when they remember there is one person at the table still unaccounted for. "And how is work?" she asked. Just that. How is work? No specifics, no actual interest, no follow-up built into the question. That had been the pattern my whole life. When Evan was in graduate school, my parents knew his test dates, his rotations, the names of his professors, how many interviews he had lined up. When I made senior director at 32, my mother said, "That's nice, honey," and asked if it meant I'd finally stop traveling so much. My job was always treated like weather. Present, vaguely inconvenient, not worth understanding. "It's good," I said. "What exactly do you do again?" Scott asked politely. Before I could answer, my brother did it for me. "Nora does paperwork," he said. I turned my head and looked at him. He smiled and took a sip of his drink. "That's not what I do," I said. "Oh?" my father said. "Then help us out, because every time your mother explains it, it sounds like forms and emails. There are humiliations that arrive like a slap, and there are humiliations that arrive dressed as confusion. Those were always my family's favorite kind. The truth was that I was director of regulatory operations for a private healthcare compliance firm in Phoenix. My team managed interstate licensing, audit preparation, acquisition transition reviews, credentialing risk, and federal documentation controls for multi-state specialty clinics. In plain English, I was the person companies called when they had grown too fast, signed the wrong thing, missed something important, or were about to discover that administrative details can cost millions if handled badly. But nobody at that table knew that. Not because I had hidden it, because they had never really asked. So I answered simply, "I oversee compliance operations for clinic groups in multiple states." Scott looked interested immediately. "Compliance in healthcare?" "Yes." "What kind?" "Mostly licensing, audit exposure, acquisition review, and documentation controls." He nodded slowly. "That's not paperwork." "No," I said, "it isn't." My father waved his hand once, dismissing the whole exchange. "Well, whatever the title is, you've always been good with detail. That's useful." Useful. That word sat on the table between us like something with teeth. Because that was how they had always seen me. Not as impressive, not as gifted, not as worth showing off. Useful. The daughter who could read contracts, catch mistakes, explain fine print, fix a form, calm a vendor, review a statement, stay late, keep the panic low. Useful in private. Invisible in public. I didn't say any of that then. I just picked up my water glass and took a sip. The glass shook once against my teeth. Across from me, Scott looked from my father to me with the slight pause of a person beginning to understand a room he had entered too late. Then my mother changed the subject. She asked Talia about floral options for the spring fundraiser. My father asked Evan about a real estate contact. And just like that, I was erased again, still physically sitting there, plate untouched, shoulders straight, listening to my own life slide out of focus at my family's table. I remember the sound of cutlery, the soft scrape of chairs on hardwood, the candle near the centerpiece burning too hot on one side, the smell of thyme from the chicken. My mother's bracelet tapping against the serving spoon every time she leaned in to play gracious hostess. I remember all of it because I knew, even then, that the night was building towards something. I just didn't know yet how far they had already gone. About 20 minutes into dinner, my father leaned back and said to Scott, "What we really need is clean timing. We're trying to avoid complications." He said it casually, but my body reacted before my mind did. Complication. That word belonged to my world, not his. I looked up. Scott set his glass down. "That's really the key," he said. "The file looks straightforward, but if there are undisclosed obligations or signature issues, things can slow down." My fork stopped halfway to my plate. "File. Signature issues," my mother answered too quickly. "We have everything under control." I turned toward her. "What file?" I asked. No one answered immediately. It was tiny, that silence. Maybe 2 seconds. But if you work where I work, 2 seconds is enough. 2 seconds tells you who expected you not to notice. My brother was the first one to recover. "It's nothing," he said. "Dad's just exploring a financing structure." "For what?" I asked. My father gave me a patient smile that made me feel about 12. "This isn't really your world, Nora." There it was. One of his favorite lines. "This isn't really your world." He had used it when I was 16 and asked why he'd opened a credit card in my mother's name to shift a balance. He used it when I was 21 and pointed out a problem in a lease my aunt was about to sign. He used it when I was 28 and caught a title issue on a condo Evan almost bought. This isn't really your world. Only somehow, when things went wrong, my phone always rang anyway. I set my fork down carefully. "Then why is a lender at family dinner?" I asked. My mother's expression tightened so slightly another person might have missed it. My father smiled again, but there was less ease in it now. "We're just trying to help Evan with an opportunity," he said. "You understand, don't you?" I looked at my brother. He looked away first. That was when I knew. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough to understand that I had not been invited to dinner because they missed me. Not because they wanted reconciliation. Not because 5 years had softened anyone. I had been brought there because something needed to be signed, reviewed, explained, or smoothed over. And they had assumed I would do what I had always done. Notice the problem. Fix it quietly. Accept the insult as the price of belonging. I sat very still and folded my napkin once on my lap. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, just cleanly. I was done arriving through side doors for people who only respected me when they were scared. And before that dinner was over, I was going to find out exactly what they had dragged me back there to protect. If you had asked my family who I was when I was growing up, they would have given you tidy answers. Responsible. Serious. A little cold. Good at school. Too intense. Helpful. That last one was the real role. Helpful. Not beloved, not celebrated. Helpful. My brother Evan was the one people gathered around. He was easy to admire. Tall, confident, bright in a way that photographed well. He knew how to walk into a room and make adults feel clever for noticing him. By 16, my mother was already talking about him like he was a future magazine profile. By 27, she introduced him at parties as our doctor, even though he was not a doctor yet. He was in finance, then healthcare investing, then some private equity adjacent thing my father liked to explain using words like platform and upside. The details changed. The family mythology didn't. My parents loved visible success, titles that fit on holiday cards, careers other people understood immediately, the kind that let them brag without having to learn anything. I was never that child. I was the one who read contracts for fun before I even knew that was strange. I was the one who noticed when our homeowner's policy had the wrong square footage listed. I was the one who caught a duplicate tuition payment on Evan's college account when I was 19 because I happened to see the statement on the counter while looking for stamps. My mother called me sharp when she wanted something and difficult when I pointed out a fact she did not like. I remember once, I was maybe 14, sitting at the kitchen island with a bowl of tomato soup. In listening to my parents panic because a contractor had sent over a change order, my father swore he had never approved. My mother was pacing. My father was angry in that polished way he had, voice low, jaw locked. Evan was upstairs. No one knew where the original paperwork was. I asked if they had checked the back page. My father looked at me like I was interrupting adults. Then he handed me the packet anyway. The signature line was on the reverse side of an addendum. He had initialed it 3 weeks earlier. I remember sliding the paper back across the granite and saying, "It's here." My mother didn't say thank you. My father didn't apologize for snapping at me. He just said, "Well, good catch." That was the beginning of it, I think. The silent understanding that I was useful in a crisis. After that, it became a pattern. At 16, I reorganized my mother's invoicing system because she kept losing track of who had paid deposits on her design consults. At 18, I built my father a spreadsheet to compare commercial loan options for a side investment he was considering with a friend from church. At 20, while I was home for winter break, I spent the week after Christmas helping Evan appeal a billing issue with his apartment complex because he had signed something without reading it. Every single time, the story was the same. They called me in when they were already irritated. They handed me the mess. I fixed it. Then they minimized what I had done because to fully acknowledge it would have required acknowledging me. That was the family pattern. Privately, I was the one who read everything. Publicly, I was the one with paperwork energy. I didn't understand how deeply that had shaped me until much later. Back then, I thought if I stayed calm enough, helpful enough, competent enough, eventually it would add up to respect. That is one of the cruelest lies a family like mine teaches you. That if you are useful long enough, love will eventually arrive behind it. It doesn't. Not always. Sometimes people just get more comfortable using you. I was 22 when I moved to Phoenix for my first real job. It was June 14th. I remember because the air that hit me outside Sky Harbor felt like somebody opening an oven. I had 2 suitcases, $4,700 in savings, a furnished studio apartment with beige carpet I hated, and an entry-level operations role at a credentialing company none of my family could explain at cocktail parties. My mother told people I worked in administration. My father told people I handled some back-office healthcare forms. Neither of those descriptions was technically false. They were also not true. What I learned in those first 3 years was how expensive paperwork becomes when it is attached to federal exposure, acquisition timelines, physician licensing, and audit risk. A missing document can delay an opening. A bad signature can void a file. An overlooked reporting requirement can bring in legal reviews so fast it makes everyone in the room suddenly interested in the person they thought was just administrative. That world made sense to me immediately. Not because I loved forms. I didn't. I loved structure. I loved traceability. I loved that the truth left marks. Dates, signatures, email chains, submission logs, metadata. The story people tell is one thing. The record is another. I was good at following the second one all the way back to the first lie. By 26, I was leading a small team. By 29, I moved to a larger firm. By 32, I was director of regulatory operations with 11 people reporting up through me and oversight across clinics in 5 states. The year I turned 33, my compensation package crossed $286,000 before bonus. That same year, I signed a lease on a condo with floor-to-ceiling windows, bought my own dining table in cash, and started looking at townhomes because I was tired of paying someone else's mortgage. Nobody in my family knew any of those numbers. Not because I hid them like a secret, because they never asked. My mother once asked if I had decent benefits. My father once asked whether my work was the kind of thing that could be outsourced. Evan once said, over Christmas drinks when I was 30, "I still don't totally get what you do." He said it laughing, like it was charming. I answered him anyway. I manage compliance infrastructure and transaction risk. He blinked and said, "See? That sounds fake." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, because at the time I still confused surviving a moment with handling it well. There were memories like that all over the years. Thanksgiving, when Evan got 10 straight minutes of conversation about an investment deal he was leading, and when my aunt asked me what was new, my mother answered for me with, "Nora's still doing her little healthcare thing." Christmas dinner, when my father asked Evan to explain cap tables to the whole table like he was giving a TED Talk, but when I corrected a legal assumption he made about reporting thresholds, my father said, "Let's not make this a seminar." My cousin's engagement party, when a family friend asked whether I had kids, and when I said no, my mother leaned in and said, "She's married to work." That line got a laugh too. What they did not know was that the little healthcare thing had me reviewing transition risk on acquisitions worth more than anything my mother's business had ever touched. They did not know my name was on internal approvals that decided whether multi-site clinics opened on time or sat delayed for months. They did not know that private equity firms and healthcare boards full of men twice my age stopped talking when I started asking questions because they had learned those questions cost money if ignored. They did not know because, again, they never cared enough to ask. And the part that hurts to admit is that for a long time I still kept showing up. Birthdays, holiday dinners, Easter lunches, fundraisers, a surprise brunch for my mother's 60th where she thanked Evan for flying in first class and thanked Talia for the flowers and hugged me for helping coordinate. Helping coordinate. That brunch, by the way, had almost fallen apart because the event manager had sent over a venue agreement with the wrong minimum spend and a cancellation clause that would have cost my parents a 5-figure penalty if weather forced a change. My father forwarded it to me at 10:18 p.m. with the subject line, "Quick look? No, hello. No, please. Just quick look?" I read it twice, flagged 7 issues, rewrote the email he should send back, and saved them $12,000 by the next morning. At brunch, my mother toasted family and said, none of this would be possible without everyone coming together. Everyone. That was how my work got absorbed in that house. Into the wallpaper, into the air, into the category of things that magically happened around them, because I was there. I don't say this for pity. I say it because it matters later. When people ask why I stayed in contact as long as I did, this is the answer. Because usefulness can feel a lot like belonging when you haven't been taught the difference. There was one person who saw it clearly before I did. Her name was Lena Ortiz, and she was my boss for 4 years. I met her at 28 when I transferred firms. She was vice president over multi-state operations and the first person in my professional life who looked at a room full of men talking over each other, then looked at me and said, "You, tell me what actually matters." I remember the first time she saw me on a Monday morning after one of my family weekends. She leaned against my office door, coffee in hand, and said, "You look like you spent your vacation testifying before Congress." I laughed, but not hard enough. She waited a second and then asked, "What did they need this time?" That question stopped me. Not what happened. Not how was your weekend. What did they need this time? I remember staring at her from behind my laptop because it was the first time anyone had named the pattern out loud. "My brother is buying into a development project," I said. My father wanted me to review the operating agreement. Lena nodded once. "And did they ask how you're doing before or after that?" I didn't answer. She smiled without humor. That's what I thought." Lena was not sentimental, which is probably why I trusted her. She didn't do motivational speeches or false softness. She did clarity. One evening, after I stayed late to finish a licensing remediation packet and then took a call from my mother in the parking garage because she just needed a quick look at a vendor contract, Lena heard enough of the conversation as she passed by to stop walking. After I hung up, she said, "Nora, you know your family thinks your expertise belongs to them, right?" I should have been offended. Instead, I felt exposed. Because she was right. That was exactly how they behaved. Not grateful for it. Entitled to it. When my father had trouble with a loan disclosure. When my mother signed a staging lease with a renewal clause she had not understood. When Evan needed to unwind from a business entity filing he had rushed through. When Talia wanted someone to quietly explain why a trust amendment her parents were discussing seemed odd. I was the person they called. Usually after hours. Usually with no context. Usually expecting urgency because they had already delayed too long. And if I answered too directly, I was tense. If I asked for documents first, I was making things hard. If I corrected them in front of anyone else, I was a little much. That phrase came from my mother. A little much. She used it the way other people use a nickname. Nora's a little much about details. Nora can be a little much when paperwork is involved. Nora means well, she just gets a little much. Meanwhile, those details kept saving them. There was the condo purchase Evan nearly completed with a disputed easement issue buried in an exhibit list. There was my mother's vendor dispute where the payment language would have exposed her personally because she had signed in the wrong capacity. There was my father's line of credit renewal, where the personal guarantee terms had shifted from the original structure, and he had not noticed. Every single one of those things was real. Every single one had numbers attached. Every single one could have turned expensive fast. And every single one ended the same way. Fixed quietly. Minimized immediately. Forgotten publicly. By the time I was 33, I had stopped offering help unless directly asked. That was one of the first boundaries I ever set, and even that felt radical. I no longer reviewed documents just because I was there. I no longer stayed after dessert to go through folders at the kitchen island. I no longer answered midnight group texts with, "Can someone explain this clause?" If they wanted my professional brain, they could ask clearly and respectfully. That small shift changed the tone of everything. My mother called me distant. My father called me rigid. Evan called me corporate in a way that was supposed to sound like an insult. But what was really happening was simpler. They were experiencing me as a person for the first time instead of a family utility. And they did not like it. About 8 months before that dinner, my mother sent me a PDF at 9:46 p.m. with no greeting, just the line, "Can you review this tonight? Need to send tomorrow." It was a vendor facility use agreement for a large spring fundraising event she was helping stage for one of her clients. I was in the middle of finalizing a licensing matrix for a clinic acquisition in Nevada and did not open her attachment for 2 hours. When I finally did, I found enough problems to make my jaw tighten. The indemnity structure was one-sided. The cancellation terms were absurd. And the signature page referenced an entity that did not match the operating company listed in the first paragraph. I called her at 11:58. She answered like she had been doing me a favor by waiting. "Well?" I let her finish that one word before answering. "This agreement is bad," I said. "Don't sign it." She sighed dramatically. "Can you not be dramatic right away?" Read page 8. A pause. Paper shifting. Then, "Oh." I talked her through it. She asked what to say. I dictated the email. She sent it the next morning. That afternoon she texted, "They fixed it. Thanks." No period. No warmth. No acknowledgement of what I had just saved her from. 3 days later, at Sunday dinner, she was telling Aunt Denise that these event people are all crooks, and thank God I caught it. I remember sitting there with my napkin in my lap, listening to her say, "Thank God I caught it," and feeling the last soft part of me begin to harden. Not into anger yet. Into accounting. Into memory. Into the quiet internal record of who had taken what and called it nothing. So when I tell you that the dinner in October was not really about seeing me, this is what I mean. By then, my family had a long history of using my mind and dismissing my worth in the same breath. They knew exactly what I could do. They just wanted to keep that knowledge private, where it did not interfere with the version of me they preferred in public. The difficult daughter. The overserious one. The one with paperwork energy. The one who was useful when things got messy and embarrassing when they didn't want to think too hard. And sitting at that corner place setting, with the plain white plate my mother had pulled from the cabinet at the last second, listening to my father and that lender use words that belonged to my world while telling me it was not my world at all, I understood something with perfect clarity. They had not invited me there despite the problem. They had invited me because of it. I just hadn't seen the full shape of that problem yet. But I was about to. And once I did, I was not going to rescue them from it again. The first thing I did after that dinner was not call anyone. I drove home. I remember the exact time because the dashboard clock turned from 9:41 to 9:42 as I sat at a red light 2 blocks from my parents' neighborhood, both hands on the wheel, my father's voice still in my ears. "You always make things harder." It is strange what becomes clear when you stop trying to be understood. By the time I pulled into my garage, I knew 3 things. First, they had deliberately kept me out of the actual conversation until something had already gone wrong. Second, my name had been floated in that room before I arrived. I knew it from the lender's phrasing, the way he had looked at me, the way he said, "I was under the impression you were involved." Third, whatever they had done, it was worse than they were admitting. I went inside, took off my shoes, set my bag on the entry bench, and did what I always do when I need to think clearly. I made tea. Not because I was calm, because ritual keeps me from panicking. I changed into sweatpants, tied my hair up, opened my laptop at the kitchen table, and started with the only thing that mattered, the record. At 10:03 p.m., I emailed myself a summary of the dinner while it was still fresh. Date, time, who was present, exact quotes, as close as memory allowed. The lender's name, the phrase, "under the impression you were involved," my father's correction, My mother's silence. Evan's expression when the line of credit was mentioned. Then I opened the family group text and searched backward. There it was. 3 weeks earlier, my father had sent a message at 7:18 a.m. Need your help on a property thing soon. Nothing urgent. Nothing urgent is family language, for we already made a mess, but we are not ready to admit that yet. I had replied at 12:04 p.m. in between meetings. Happy to take a look when I have documents. He had never sent them. 6 days later, my mother texted separately. Question. If someone is adding a short-term bridge note to a property transaction, does it matter who's listed as operating member on the receiving LLC? I had written back, yes. Very much. Don't sign or submit anything until I've seen the structure. No response. I stared at that exchange for a long minute. Then I read it again. That was the moment the outline of it began to appear. Not the full thing, just the edge. An LLC. A bridge note. A property transaction. My father asking for help, then going quiet. My mother fishing for a specific answer without context. A lender assuming I was involved. I did not call them. I did not text. I did not ask for clarification. I opened a fresh document and titled it, October, Family Property Matter. Under that, I started building a timeline. That is what people like my family never understand about me. They think my strength is that I read carefully. It isn't. My strength is that I notice patterns between things people think are separate. A bad joke at dinner. A missing attachment. A vague question. A lender using the wrong tense. A sudden invitation. A too careful silence. Individually, they can be explained away. Together, they tell the truth. At dis current set PM, I texted one person. Lena. Still up? She called me instead of replying. I put her on speaker and told her everything from the dinner, start to finish. She let me get through it without interrupting, which is how I know she was alarmed. Most people interrupt when they still think a story might resolve into something smaller. When I finished, she asked one question. Did they use your name? I looked down at my notes. Not directly in front of me. In front of the lender? I think so. She was quiet for half a second. Then she said, Nora, I want you to listen to me carefully. Do not verbally advise them. Do not review anything informally. Do not get pulled into a family version of damage control. If your name has already been floated and the transaction is in motion, you need written distance now. That phrase landed hard. Written distance. Not emotional distance. Not boundaries in theory. Written distance. I leaned back in my chair. You think it's that bad? I think people who've spent years using your professional credibility casually don't suddenly develop restraint when money is on the table. I stared at the steam rising off my tea. What do I do? Document everything. Ask for the full file in writing if you want it. And if they don't give it to you, you withdraw in writing from any current or implied involvement. Tonight, if possible. Certainly by morning. I remember saying, that feels severe. Lena's answer was immediate. No. It feels late. That kept me awake half the night. Not because she was wrong. Because she was right in a way I had been avoiding for years. At 6:12 the next morning, my mother texted, Can you stop by this afternoon? We need to clear up some confusion from last night. Clear up some confusion. Not apologize. Not explain. Not ask. I read it once, then again, then set the phone face down. At 6:19, my father texted, Need you to sign off on a few things verbally with lender. 10-minute call max. There it was. Not a conversation. Not context. Not truth. A request for me to lend my voice to something I had not seen. I did not answer either message. Instead, I showered, dressed for work, and sat down at my desk at 7:04 with my laptop open and a legal pad beside it. Then I wrote the first clean boundary I had ever written to my family in professional language. Subject, no involvement in property transaction. Dad. Mom. After last night's dinner, I need to be clear in writing that I am not involved in, and have not reviewed, any current property transaction, financing arrangement, bridge note, or related entity structure you may be pursuing. I have not reviewed documents, provided advice, approved structure, or agreed to communicate with any lender, broker, attorney, or third party on your behalf in connection with this matter. Please do not represent that I am participating in any capacity. If you would like formal input, You may send complete documentation for review, and I will decide whether I am willing to look at it. Unless and until I confirm in writing, assume I am not involved. Nora. I read it 3 times before sending. Then I sent it to both of them at 7:18 a.m. The same minute, by the way, as my father's original, "Need your help" text 3 weeks earlier. I did not do that on purpose. But when I noticed it afterward, I wrote the time down anyway. At 7:31, my phone rang. Dad. I let it ring out. At set, 34, Mom. Then Dad again at 7:36. At 7:41, a voicemail. Nora, this is ridiculous. No one is using your name. Don't make this bigger than it is. Just call me. I saved the voicemail. At 7:49, another. This time my mother. I don't know why you're being so cold about this. We just need to smooth over a misunderstanding. You're acting like strangers. That line almost made me laugh. You're acting like strangers. As if that had not been their preferred family structure all along, so long as I kept being useful. At 8:06, as I was walking into the office, Lena saw my face and held up a hand before I even got to her doorway. Did you send it? Yes. Good. Forward me a copy to your personal email, too. I did. Then I went to work. That part matters. Because if you are going to withdraw from chaos, you need somewhere sane to stand while it unfolds. By 9:22, I had 3 more texts. My father. The lender is confused because of your email. Please correct this immediately. My mother. You are embarrassing us. And then, from Evan. Seriously? You're torching this over dinner attitude? Grow up. Dinner attitude. I remember staring at those words in the fluorescent office light and thinking, with complete calm, they still think this is emotional leverage. They still think if they can make me feel dramatic, I'll step back into the role. At 10:11, I got the call that changed everything. It was from a number I didn't know. I answered because my work line had been forwarded to my mobile for a licensing issue out of Nevada. Instead, a male voice said, "Hi, Nora. This is David Mercer with Front Range Private Lending. I'm calling because your father suggested there may have been a crossed wire regarding your participation on the Willow Creek matter." Willow Creek. A name at last. A project name always makes a mess more real. I sat down in the small conference room nearest my office door and closed it quietly behind me. Can you clarify what you mean by my participation? A pause. Then careful, professional backtracking. Well, my understanding was that you had reviewed the compliance and entity structure side and were expected to help finalize operational documentation once we moved to closing. I documented the time. 10 to 12 us amen. Then I said the most important sentence of that week. I need to be completely clear. I have not reviewed any documents related to Willow Creek. I am not participating in the transaction, and I do not authorize anyone to state otherwise. His tone changed immediately. Not hostile. Sharper. I appreciate the clarification. That sentence told me more than his next 5 minutes of words. Because professionals only sound like that when something they were told has just broken in their hands. I asked, was my name used in written communications? Another pause. I'm not sure I can discuss internal correspondence. You don't need to. I just need to know whether anyone represented me as involved. A longer pause this time. Then, your name appeared in prior context, yes. I wrote that down exactly. Your name appeared in prior context, yes. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat perfectly still for maybe 10 seconds. Not because I was shocked, because the room had just changed shape. This was no longer family disrespect. It was misrepresentation. Maybe careless, maybe strategic, maybe both. Either way, it had crossed the line from emotional pattern into factual exposure. I forwarded myself my notes immediately. Then I sent a second email. Subject: further clarification. No authorization to use my name. Dad, Mom, Evan. I was contacted this morning by a third party involved in the Willow Creek matter and informed that my name had previously been presented in a way that suggested participation or review on my part. To be absolutely clear, I have not reviewed any documents related to Willow Creek, have not approved any structure, and have not authorized anyone to reference me as involved in this matter. Do not use my name, title, experience, or professional background in connection with this transaction in any written, verbal, or implied way. If this has already occurred, I expect you to correct it immediately with any relevant third party. Nora. I copied my personal email. I saved a PDF. I documented the send time. To 5 to 20 a.m. Then I called Lena and said, "It's worse." She was in my doorway in under 30 seconds. I told her about the lender. I told her the project name, the phrase, prior context, the implied review, the correction. She listened, then said, "Okay, no more direct conversation, written only from now on, and if anyone sends documents, don't touch them unless you decide you want formal engagement terms. Family or not." At 11:03, my father replied all. "You are overreacting. The lender misunderstood a casual mention that you work in this area. No one claimed you signed off on anything. Stop escalating this." Overreacting. Misunderstood. Casual mention. Stop escalating this. I read it and felt something inside me go very still. Because buried in his denial was the admission. My name had come up. He had introduced my expertise into the room. He had benefited from the impression. And now that the impression had consequences, suddenly everything was a misunderstanding. At 11:11, my mother sent a separate text. "Can you please just help us get through this first and then we can talk about hurt feelings later?" That line was the cleanest expression of our family system I had ever seen. Help us get through this first. Meaning, protect us now. Process your own pain later. Meaning, your value is in your usefulness, not your humanity. Meaning, resume your assigned role and maybe afterward we'll let you call it unfair. I did not respond. Instead, I opened a notebook page and wrote at the top, "What exactly are they trying to close?" Then underneath, "Who drafted the structure? Who introduced my name? Who has documents? Who assumes I'm involved? What happens if I do nothing?" That last question stayed with me. What happens if I do nothing? Not because I wanted revenge. Because for the first time, doing nothing was not passive. Doing nothing meant not rescuing. That distinction mattered. All week, the calls escalated. Thursday, 5 calls, 2 voicemails. 1 email from my mother marked urgent. Friday, a call from Evan at 6:44 a.m. Another from my father at 7:02. A voicemail from my mother crying hard enough to sound almost convincing. "Nora, please. We are dealing with enough right now. You know how these men are. They hear one thing and panic. Just tell them you looked at it informally. That's all we need. Just tell them you looked at it informally." I replayed that message 3 times because I wanted to make sure I had heard it correctly. Then I saved it in a folder labeled Family October. The thing about desperation is that it removes polish faster than anger. By Saturday, the image-conscious family that never wanted a wrinkle in public was leaving me messages that sounded frantic, sloppy, exposed. At 1:18 p.m. on Saturday, Evan texted, "If this falls apart, do not expect me to forget that you did this." I looked at that sentence for a long time. Did this. As if withdrawing my name from something I had never agreed to was the act. As if their using it had been neutral. As if my refusal to absorb the risk counted as aggression. I did not answer him either. That weekend I did something else instead. I started looking up the Willow Creek address. It took me less than 40 minutes to piece together the basics. It was a mixed-use redevelopment parcel under a newly formed entity. The entity was young. The financing looked stacked. There was a bridge component exactly as my mother had hinted. And the structure was thin in the way family confidence often is when it borrows against optimism. I did not hack anything. I did not cross any legal line. I just read what was public and compared it against what they had accidentally revealed. By Sunday evening, I knew enough to understand why they were panicking. The transaction was time-sensitive. The lender wanted clean documentation. Someone had made them believe professional oversight existed where it did not. And if that confidence evaporated at the wrong moment, everything would slow down, maybe stop. I also knew something else. They were not going to stop using my name because I had asked nicely. They were going to stop when a system made it inconvenient. That is when I made the decision that changed the rest of the story. I was not going to chase them privately anymore. I was going to wait for the room, wait for the witnesses, wait until whatever they had built without me started showing its seams in public. Because people like my family do not hear truth best in the kitchen. They hear it best when someone else is at the table. The public part started on a Wednesday. I remember because I had a standing 8:30 a.m. call with our Phoenix office, and I was halfway through explaining a licensing delay when my personal phone lit up with a number I now recognized immediately. David Mercer. The lender. I let it go once. Then it rang again at 8:47. I texted back. In meetings until 10. If this concerns Willow Creek, please email. He replied in under a minute. Need to speak briefly. Something has changed. I finished my call, closed my laptop, and sat there for a second with both hands wrapped around a cooling mug of coffee. Something has changed. At 10:02, he called again. This time I answered. His voice was tighter than before. Still professional, less controlled. Miss Hart, I'll keep this short. We've requested an in-person clarification meeting this afternoon with the principals on Willow Creek. There are inconsistencies we need resolved before we proceed. I wrote the time down automatically. 10. Calo do AM. Then I asked, what kind of inconsistencies? Another pause. The entity structure and operational oversight representations don't fully align with the documents we now have. Documents we now have. Not documents they meant to provide. Not documents they thought existed. The ones they had. I kept my voice level. And where do I come in? He exhaled once. Your name came up again this morning. That sentence should have made me angry. Instead, it made me feel almost calm. Like a diagnosis after weeks of symptoms. I want to be clear again, I said. I am not involved in Willow Creek in any capacity. Yes, he said quickly. That was my understanding from your prior messages, which is why I'm calling. I thought it best that you know there may be an assumption in the room this afternoon that you are expected to appear. Expected to appear. I actually closed my eyes for a second. Not because I was overwhelmed. Because it was such a perfect expression of my family's logic. Of course they had not corrected it. Of course they had let things continue drifting toward a room where my usefulness could simply be summoned. Of course the plan, whether spoken or not, was that I would arrive and stabilize what they had made unstable. When is the meeting? I asked. 3:30. Our downtown office. 6th floor conference suite. I looked over at my notebook. Wednesday. Thinga, Tagapalis Pi, M. Downtown office. 6th floor. Then I asked the question that mattered. Who will be there? He listed them. My father. My mother. Yvonne. The lender team. Outside counsel. A broker I didn't know. And, he added after a pause, possibly a minority operating member from the seller's side. Witnesses. That mattered more than anything. Not because I wanted an audience. Because truth lands differently when it has nowhere private to hide. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat still for maybe 30 seconds before walking straight to Lena's office. She looked up once and said, What happened? There's a meeting at 3:30. They may be expecting me to show up. She leaned back in her chair. Are you going? I thought about it. Part of me wanted to stay far away and let the whole thing collapse without my face anywhere near it. But another part of me, the clearer part, knew this was the room. The room where they had been performing competence. The room where my name had been used. The room where someone else's professional assumptions were carrying them farther than they deserved. Yes, I said, but not to help. Lena nodded once. Good. Then go as yourself. Not as family support. Not as informal review. Just as the person whose name has been used without consent. I remember saying, I don't want this to turn into a scene. She gave me a look that was almost kind. Nora, calm truth in a dishonest room always feels like a scene to the people who benefit from the lie. That line stayed with me all afternoon. I did not rush. That part also matters. I finished my immediate work. I forwarded my voicemail folder and email chain to my personal archive again. I printed the 2 emails I had sent withdrawing involvement. I printed my father's reply calling it a misunderstanding. I printed my mother's text asking me to just help us get through this first. And I placed them in a slim black folder. No dramatics. No speeches. Just paper. At doi. 4:01. I changed out of office flats into low heels because the building they were meeting in had marble floors and long hallways, and I wanted to feel steady when I walked them. I wore a navy blouse, charcoal trousers, my hair pulled back, small gold hoops, no jacket, not armor, just myself. At 3:18, I parked in the underground garage and sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. This was the point I knew where younger versions of me would have still been asking the wrong question. How do I make them understand? By then, I had finally learned the better one. How do I stop participating in misunderstanding on their terms? I took the folder, locked the car, and went upstairs. The sixth floor receptionist looked up and asked who I was there to see. I gave my name. The flicker in her expression told me she recognized it. Not personally. Contextually, that was enough. You're expected, she said. Of course I was. She led me down a corridor lined with frosted glass and framed aerial photos of developments no one actually lives in the way the brochures promise. At the conference room door, I could hear voices. My father's was the clearest, confident, slightly louder than necessary. Then the door opened, and the room changed. I have been in enough conference rooms to know the exact sound a conversation makes when everyone realizes the wrong version of reality has just walked in. Not silence exactly. A break in momentum. A collective recalculation. My father was standing near the end of the table, one hand on the back of a leather chair, mid-sentence. My mother was seated with her handbag open beside her and that fixed social smile she wears when she thinks charm is still on the table. Evan was to her right, jaw tight, phone face down in front of him for once. 3 people from the lender side. 1 older attorney, a broker in a tan suit. And across from my father, a woman I guessed was the seller side operating member, looking irritated in the contained way of someone who bills by the hour. Every head turned toward me. My father recovered first. Nora, he said, smiling like he had invited me 10 minutes ago. Good. You made it. I did not walk to him. I walked to the empty chair nearest the end of the table, set my folder down, and said, I'm here because my name has continued to be raised in connection with Willow Creek after I stated in writing that I am not involved. No one spoke. The lender's attorney, a gray-haired man with rimless glasses, glanced at David Mercer and then back at me. My mother gave a small laugh that sounded brittle. That's not quite what's happening, she said. I turned to her. Then this should be easy to clarify. The older attorney introduced himself, Martin Kell, outside counsel for the lending side. He asked, Miss Hart, are you currently advising any party in this transaction? No. Have you reviewed the entity structure, financing documentation, or operational compliance materials for Willow Creek? No. Have you authorized any person in this room to imply otherwise? No. He nodded once and wrote something down. That was all. No accusation. No raised voice. Just 3 questions and 3 answers. But the air in the room went thin immediately. Because a lot of things can survive family denial. They do not survive clean answers in front of counsel. My father tried to step in. Let's not make this sound more dramatic than it is, he said. Nora's familiar with this kind of work. We may have referenced that casually while trying to explain that the family has expertise around the project. I opened my folder, took out the first printed email, and slid it across the table toward Martin Kell. This is the email I sent at 7:18 a.m. last Thursday, stating I was not involved in any property transaction, financing arrangement, bridge note, or related entity structure, and that my name was not to be used. Then I placed the second one down beside it. And this is the follow-up I sent at 10:26 a.m., after being contacted by a third party and learning my name had apparently appeared in prior context. Martin read both. Slowly. The woman from the seller side held out her hand without a word. He passed them to her. My father's face changed then, not dramatically, just a hard tightening around the mouth. The broker spoke next. I think everyone is getting a little lost in language here. We all understood Miss Hart wasn't formally engaged. The issue was more that the family had relevant background around operational review. I turned to him. I do have relevant background. What I do not have is involvement. He nodded too quickly. Right, of course. Then I asked the question I had written in my notebook days earlier. Was my name still being used after I withdrew? That was the question. Not emotional. Not vague. Not about respect. A factual question sharp enough to puncture performance. No one answered immediately. My father looked at the broker. The broker looked at David Mercer. My mother stared at the table. Evan shifted in his chair. The seller side woman gave a short exhale through her nose. That silence told me more than any explanation would have. I repeated the question. Was my name still being used after I withdrew? This time David answered. Your name remained part of discussions about anticipated operational oversight. Yes, there it was. Not a scream. Not a confession in flames. Just a sentence. Your name remained part of discussions. My mother finally found her voice. That sounds worse than it was, she said quickly. No one was trying to trap Nora into anything. We were trying to reassure people that there was real competence around the project. I looked at her. You were trying to borrow my credibility after I refused to lend it. The seller-side woman looked up sharply at that. Martin Kell folded his hands. Mr. and Mrs. Hart, I need to ask directly whether representations were made that Miss Hart had reviewed or would be participating in compliance, documentation, or operational structure on this transaction. My father started with, not exactly. Martin cut in. That is not a yes or no. The room got even quieter. My father tried again. We indicated she was familiar with these issues and that she might come in at a later stage if needed. If needed. Like I was an emergency service. Like I was infrastructure. Like I had no say in whether my own name could be mobilized for family benefit. I took out one more sheet from my folder. A printout of my mother's text. Can you please just help us get through this first and then we can talk about hurt feelings later? I did not need to say much. I just slid it toward the middle of the table. The seller-side woman read it first. Then David. Then Martin. Evan muttered. Jesus, under his breath. Though whether at me or them or himself, I couldn't tell. My mother's face went pale. That was private. I looked at her and said the calmest true thing I had. So was my professional reputation until you made it useful. No one in the room moved. No one needed to, because by then the lie had become administratively inconvenient, and that is when systems stop pretending not to notice. Martin Kell cleared his throat. Given the discrepancy between prior representations and the actual status of Miss Hart's involvement, we cannot proceed today as scheduled. The broker straightened. Now hold on. No, Martin said, not loudly. We cannot. He turned to David. I want a full revised disclosure memo on every representation made regarding oversight, compliance review, entity structure, and operating capacity. I also want confirmation of who said what, to whom, and when. Then to the seller-side woman. You and your counsel will receive that before we discuss any further movement. She nodded once, lips pressed thin. My father started talking then. Too fast. This is still workable. We can bring someone else in. We can replace that function. We can revise whatever language is bothering people. I almost felt sorry for him in that moment, because he still did not understand the thing that had actually broken. It wasn't the staffing. It wasn't even me. It was trust in the room. And once the room stops trusting the people across the table, replacing one function with another is just paperwork overwrought. The seller-side woman stood. This should have been disclosed before today, she said. Not angry. Worse than angry. Done. She gathered her notebook and added, We were told structure and oversight were stable. They are clearly not. Then she left. Just like that. No theatrics. No slam doors. Just departure. But it hit the table like a collapse. David Mercer stayed seated for another minute, collecting papers with the weary precision of someone who knows his afternoon just became 3 weeks of cleanup. My mother looked at me then, really looked at me and said, Are you happy now? It was such a small sentence. So familiar. So tired. The lifelong assumption underneath it was the same as always. If truth costs us something, your motive must have been cruelty. I held her gaze and answered, No, I'm clear. That was harder for her than anger would have been, because anger she could dismiss. Clarity she could not. Martin began organizing the remaining documents into his briefcase. The broker was already half standing, trying to call someone without seeming like he was calling someone. Evan finally spoke directly to me. You really couldn't just help us once? I turned to him. I had been helping you for years. You just stopped recognizing it because I stopped doing it for free. He looked away first. That mattered more than I expected. My father stayed seated after everyone else began moving, both hands flat on the table, staring at the grain in the wood like it might rearrange into a different ending if he waited long enough. He said, without looking up, You made this public. I almost corrected him. But the truth was simpler. No, I said. You did that the moment you put my name in a room I never entered. Then I closed my folder. No speech. No victory lap. No final wound. I just stood, thanked Martin for the clarification, nodded to David, and walked out before anyone could turn me back into the family solution. In the elevator down, my hands started shaking for the first time all day. Not because I regretted it, because my body was finally catching up to what the room had been holding. By the time I got to the parking garage, I had 3 missed calls from my mother, 1 from my father, and 2 from Evan. I did not answer any of them. I sat in the driver's seat, put the folder on the passenger side, and stared through the windshield at the gray concrete wall in front of me. Then I did the one thing I knew would matter later. I wrote down everything that had happened while it was still exact. Who was present? Who answered which question? The sentence Martin used. The cellar-side woman's departure. The words, "Your name," remained part of discussions. The time I left the room. 86, 19:07. I sent the notes to myself. Then I drove home. By 6:07 that evening, the first panic voicemail arrived. The first voicemail came from my mother at 6:07 p.m. Her voice was thin and fast, the way it gets when she is trying to outrun reality with tone. "Nora, call me back. Immediately. This has gone too far. You made your point in that room. There is no reason to keep making this worse." I listened to it once. Then I saved it. The second came from my father at 6:19. Less panic. More anger, trying to sound controlled. "You embarrassed us in front of lenders, counsel, and the seller. If this transaction fails because you wanted to make a family issue into a professional spectacle, that's on you." That one I also saved. The third came from Evan at 6:43. "No greeting. Was my name still being used after you withdrew? Really? That's the line you wanted to use in front of everyone? You knew exactly what that would do." Yes, I thought. I did. Because it was the truth. By 7:10, I had 7 voicemails, 11 texts, and 2 emails. My mother's texts came in waves. "Please call me. You are being unbelievably cold. We can still fix this if you stop now. I'm your mother. I am under so much stress." My father sent one email with the subject line, "Immediate clarification required." Inside it, he wrote 3 short paragraphs trying to turn the afternoon into a misunderstanding caused by outside parties overreacting to incomplete impressions. I read it once, then archived it. Evan sent a final message at "Why do?" "If this blows up the entire deal, I hope it was worth it." I remember staring at that sentence for a long time. Not because it hurt, because even then, after everything, he still phrased it as though I had caused the instability by naming it instead of them causing it by building on it. That was always the family talent. Treat exposure like the original offense. At opt, "Patrzyć się unu," Lena texted me. "How bad is it?" I called her. She listened while I walked her through the room, the questions, the text printout, the cellar-side member leaving, Martin Kell pausing the process. When I finished, she said exactly what I needed someone sane to say. "You didn't blow anything up. You stopped them from placing your name underneath something unstable." Then she added, "Now, do the hard part. Stay out of it." She was right. Because once a family system starts collapsing, there is always one last invitation to resume your old role. Translator, fixer, buffer, cleaner, the reasonable one. The next morning at 7:13, David Mercer emailed. The subject line was brief. Update. He wrote that the lender had formally paused Willow Creek, pending revised disclosures, internal review, and reassessment of operational viability. He also wrote that any future movement would require materially different documentation and a clear separation between prior informal representations and actual available oversight. Plain English. The deal, as they had been selling it, was gone. At 7:31, my mother called again. Then my father. Then Evan. I turned my phone face down and went to work. That was one of the strangest parts of that month. How ordinary my days stayed while theirs came apart. I still had meetings. Still reviewed files. Still answered emails. Still stopped for coffee from the place downstairs where the barista always wrote my name correctly without asking. Meanwhile, at home, the old machine was finally running without its hidden parts. And it did what bad systems do when no one keeps them level. It started shaking. 3 days after the meeting, my Aunt Claire called. I almost didn't answer. But she had been kind to me when I was younger in the quiet way some people are kind. Never enough to stop anything, but enough that I remembered. Her voice came out low and tired. "Your mother is a mess." I didn't say anything. "She says you set them up." I let that sit there. Then I asked, Did she tell you my name was still being used after I withdrew? Claire hesitated. That's not how she tells it. No, I said. I didn't think so. She sighed. The lender's asking for revised disclosures. The seller side is looking at alternatives. Your father says the broker is trying to salvage something smaller. Evan says half the investor group is spooked. There it was. Not one big, movie-style collapse. Not fireworks, just the very realistic sound of confidence draining out of a project that had depended on assumed competence. Claire lowered her voice. Was it really that bad? I remember looking out my office window at the parking lot 3 floors below and saying, very calmly, worse. They knew I was out. They kept my name in the room anyway. She went quiet after that. Then she said, almost to herself, I don't know why they always think you'll come back and make things work. Neither did I. Or maybe I did. Because I had trained them to think that. Not intentionally. Just by surviving them. That was the ugly part I had to admit to myself later. I had spent years being competent in a way that looked, from the outside, like availability. And families like mine confuse those things all the time. By the second week, the formal consequences started arriving in pieces. First, the seller side withdrew exclusive negotiation rights. Not with drama, not with accusation, just a letter. David forwarded me a redacted copy because my name had been mentioned in the prior discussion chain and he thought I should know the matter was no longer active. The language was clean and corporate. After further review, our client has elected not to proceed under the current structure. Current structure. That phrase made me laugh once, quietly, in my kitchen. Because that was the whole story. Not just Willow Creek, my family. The current structure no longer worked once one person stopped holding it up. A few days after that, Evan showed up at my apartment. That was the only time he came in person. I heard the buzzer at 7:22 p.m., looked at the panel, and saw his face tipped up toward the camera. No tie, no polished expression, just exhaustion and anger worn thin. I didn't let him up. I answered through the speaker. What do you want? His voice crackled back. To talk. We've done that. No, you've made statements. That's not the same thing. I almost smiled. There was the old logic again. My boundaries as a communication flaw. My refusals as tone problems. I'm not letting you in, I said. He exhaled hard enough that it buzzed through the speaker. Fine, then listen. Dad's trying to refinance personal exposure. Mom's being chased by vendors. The investors think we lied. The seller thinks we padded oversight. The lender thinks we're unstable. This is a disaster. I leaned against the wall beside the panel and answered with the only thing that mattered. Yes. He was silent for a second. Then he said, You really don't care, do you? That question stayed with me because it was both unfair and honest. Unfair because of course I cared. Honest because what he meant was, you aren't coming back. I care, I said. I'm just not rescuing you. He gave a short, humorless laugh. So that's it. That's it. Then he said something quieter. You know Mom's saying you always wanted this. I closed my eyes for a moment. No, I said. She always needed that to be true. I disconnected before he could answer. The next message came from my father 2 days later. Not rage this time. An actual email asking if I would attend one final family meeting to clear the air. I read it twice. Then once more. He suggested Sunday at 4. Their house. Just family. I replied with one line. I'm willing to meet in a neutral place, in daylight, with written documents on the table. I will not discuss feelings until facts are acknowledged. He did not like that. His answer came back 9 minutes later. This is exactly the kind of legalistic coldness that has made everything harder. I remember laughing at that. Not because it was funny, because families like mine call precision cruelty whenever precision removes their ability to blur things. The meeting happened the following Tuesday at a hotel lobby conference room that Claire arranged. I chose the location for one reason. No one behaves quite as privately in a semi-public room. My father was already there when I arrived, seated upright at the table with a legal pad in front of him he had probably no intention of actually using. My mother looked puffy and underslept. Evan looked gray. Claire sat off to one side like someone regretting every life choice that had led her there. I brought a thin stack of printed pages and a bottle of water. No one hugged me. That part was a relief. My father opened with, We need to find a way through this. I set my papers down but did not sit immediately. No, I said. You need to understand what this is before you try to move through it. Then I sat. My mother immediately started crying. Not softly, not theatrically, exactly, but with the familiar force of someone whose emotion always enters a room first and expects everything else to organize around it. Nora, she said, we know mistakes were made. I held up a hand. No, start smaller. She blinked at me. What? Start with facts. That was the entire meeting, really. Their instinct was story. Mine was sequence, so I made them do sequence. I put the first email in the middle of the table. This is my written withdrawal. Then the second. This is the follow-up after third-party contact. Then the text from my mother. This is you asking me to help you get through it first. Then a summary note I had written after the lender meeting with date, time, names present, and the sentence David had spoken. Your name remained part of discussions. My father tried to wave that off. We thought there might still be room for you to come back in at a later stage. I cut in. That is not what happened. What happened is that after I said no, you continued allowing people to believe my name was attached to oversight. My mother shook her head. We were under pressure. Yes, I said, and? That stopped her. Because pressure was always the family excuse. As if stress transformed bad conduct into weather. Evan spoke next. We never thought it would go that far. I looked at him. That's because you never thought the system would stop recognizing me as yours to use. Silence. My father looked down at the papers. Then, finally, quietly, he said, we expected you to come in if things got tight. There it was. Not a loque. Not apologetic. Just true. I remember the room after that sentence. No one moved. Claire actually shut her eyes. My mother started crying again, but differently now. Less performance. More collapse. Because once the sentence existed in the room, everything else had to arrange around it. You expected me to come in if things got tight. The sentence explained the deal. The texts. The phone calls. The anger. It explained my whole childhood, if I was being honest. I asked one final question. Would you have told the lender and the seller that I had withdrawn if the deal had gone smoothly? No one answered. That was answer enough. I closed the folder. Then I said what I had come there to say. I'm not reviewing your structures. I'm not attending meetings. I'm not speaking to brokers, lenders, vendors, or counsel. My name is not to be used in connection with any deal, entity, refinance, or property matter going forward. If it is, I will respond in writing immediately and directly. My father's jaw tightened. You're talking to us like clients. No, I said. If you were clients, you'd be paying me. Even Claire laughed once at that before catching herself. My mother looked at me with red eyes and said, So, that's all we are to you now? I took a breath before answering. No, that's what you became the moment you started treating my competence like family property. I stood. No one tried to stop me. That was new. No grabbing my arm. No follow-up argument in the parking lot. No final emotional ambush. Just stunned stillness. I walked out of that conference room and into a bright hotel lobby where someone in heels was checking in for a dental conference and two older men were discussing golf near the elevators. Normal life. I remember loving that for a second. How ordinary the world stays while private structures finally admit they are broken. The rest took time. My mother's business did not explode overnight. It thinned. 2 staging contracts pulled out. Then another. Then one of her regular real estate agents shifted her listings elsewhere. The vendors started requiring shorter payment terms. Then deposits. Then, in one case Claire told me about later, payment up front. People do not always punish dishonesty directly. Sometimes they just stop extending trust. That is quieter. And worse. My father did manage a refinance eventually, but not the one he wanted. He sold off part of his investment portfolio at a loss and took terms ugly enough that he stopped pretending everything was temporary. He also stopped talking about the family project entirely. By winter, Willow Creek was gone. Not paused. Gone. The seller sold to another group with less flash and better paper. David Mercer sent me a final note months later after an unrelated industry event. Just so you know, they closed with a different buyer. Cleaner structure, slower process, better team. That last phrase stayed with me. Better team. Sometimes justice is no more glamorous than being accurately replaced. Evan changed too, though not quickly. For a while he sent clipped holiday texts and nothing else. Then one day in February, almost 5 months later, he emailed asking for the name of the outside trainer Lena had once recommended for entity governance. Not for the family. For himself, he wrote. I stared at that email for a long time. Then I sent him the name. No warmth. No rebuilding speech. Just the name. Separate channels. That was the rule now. My mother took longer. Her apologies changed shape over time. At first they were about stress, then misunderstanding, then pressure, then family falling apart. Months later, one finally arrived that was at least partly real. It said, I am beginning to understand that I only called your seriousness a problem when it made my life less convenient. I think I taught myself that needing you was the same as valuing you, and those are not the same thing. I read that one twice. Then I put the phone down and stood at my kitchen window for a while. It was raining lightly, and the glass had that muted gray look it gets before real weather settles in. I didn't answer right away. Eventually I wrote back, understanding is a start, it is not repair. That was all. And it was enough. Because by then I had my own life in full visible shape. 6 months after the lender meeting, I closed on a townhouse on the east side. Not huge. Not dramatic. Just mine. 2 bedrooms. A small office with morning light. A narrow balcony that looked onto a row of maples. A kitchen with more drawers than I needed and none of the ghosts of other people's emergencies in it. The day I got the keys, Lena came with me. We stood in the empty living room while the realtor did the final cheerful walkthrough and then left us alone. I set my bag on the floor and just listened. No raised voices. No bargaining. No panic. No one calling from another room asking where a document was. Just quiet. Lena looked at me and said, well? I remember smiling for real then. It's the first place I've ever had. I said, that doesn't come with an invisible job description. We bought bad takeout that night and sat on the floor eating noodles out of cartons because I hadn't moved furniture in yet. It was one of the happiest meals I've ever had. Not because anything grand had happened, because nothing was being extracted from me while I ate. A few weeks later, I did something else that mattered. I helped my grandmother. Not through my parents. Not through the family group text. Directly. She had always been quiet in the wrong moments, which caused its own kind of damage, but she was also older now and less steady with paperwork than she used to be. She called me one afternoon because she had received a renewal packet related to a small assisted living reserve unit she was considering, and she didn't trust herself to read the legal language right. So I went over on a Saturday. Just me and her at the dining table. I read the packet, marked the timelines, explained the cancellation terms, flagged one addendum she should have a local elder law attorney review before signing. We drank tea afterward in her sunny kitchen. Halfway through the second cup, she said quietly, I should have spoken up sooner, about all of it. I believed her. And I also knew believing her didn't erase the years. That would have mattered, I said. She nodded without defending herself. I know. That conversation felt more honest than any family meeting we had ever had. No rewriting. No image management. Just 2 women at a table and one clean sentence of regret. I still keep boundaries. That is the part people always want to turn into a moral lesson about forgiveness. And I won't. Some things softened. Some didn't. I speak to Claire occasionally. To my grandmother directly. To Evan rarely and only when it stays factual. To my mother sometimes, carefully, in short exchanges that do not drift into performance. My father and I have the thinnest contact of all. There was no big reconciliation dinner, no speech, no perfect Christmas. Just a series of choices made more honestly than before. And maybe that is better. Because the real lesson was never about teaching them how badly they had hurt me. It was about finally understanding the difference between being useful and being loved. My family had confused those things for years. So had I. I thought if I kept solving, carrying, translating, protecting, reviewing, stabilizing, then eventually belonging would arrive behind it. It didn't. What arrived instead was exhaustion dressed up as competence. And the second lesson was this. Quiet justice does not always look like winning. Sometimes it looks like refusing to continue under false terms. Sometimes it looks like letting a room hear the sentence everyone has been avoiding. Sometimes it looks like printed emails on a table. A calm answer. A deal that no longer gets to hide behind your name. I did not destroy my family. I stopped protecting them from the consequences of pretending I was theirs to use. That is different. And the difference matters. If you're listening to this and you are the person everyone calls too serious, too rigid, too exact, too difficult, ask yourself one honest question. Are you difficult? Or are you just the one who can still see the structure clearly while everyone else benefits from blur? I know my answer now. I bought my own home. I sleep through the night. I help where I choose, not where I'm assigned. And when my phone lights up with panic, I no longer confuse urgency with obligation. That was the whole point. Not revenge. Relief.